My name is Lila Rose, and I'm the president of Live Action, and I'm so excited to have with us Sue Ellen Browder, a writer and investigative journalist who worked for Cosmopolitan magazine for over 20 years, starting in 1970 and leading up into the 90s. Sue has recently come out with an amazing must-read book called Subverted: How I Helped the Sexual Revolution Hijack the Women's Movement. She's here with us to share more about her amazing book and her story. Thanks for being with us, Sue.
It's a great joy to be here. Thank you, Lila.
So tell us first how you got started in journalism leading up to the time when you started to work for Cosmo.
I grew up in Iowa and I wanted to be a journalist. I went to the University of Missouri School of Journalism, got a great degree, went to California, took a year and worked in a newspaper. And actually at that time, this was in the 1960s, I was actually fired for being pregnant at this newspaper.
So who fired you?
The editors. That was policy. Yeah, it was at the South Bay Daily Breeze.
And what year was that?
That was in 1969.
Wow.
And I didn't know, I had no idea that you'd be fired for being pregnant, but they said you could only work 5 months and after that you'd have to quit with no promise of having a job when you'd come back. So I pretended that I was only 5 months pregnant when I was actually 8 months pregnant.
Well done.
And I'm very short, and I was waddling around like an elephant, and people were saying, "Oh my goodness, really? 5 months?"
But the editor outright came and said, "You're fired for being pregnant."
Yeah, well, yes.
And I want to address that because it seems it could be indicative of real problems women were facing then and still many are facing today. What was the culture like in the 50s and the 60s for women?
Well, people don't remember how bad it was for women. When women were going into the workforce, they were finding a lot of injustices that they didn't expect. That was only one of them. The women were not paid what men were paid for doing the same jobs. Women were fired for being pregnant. A woman who was a flight attendant, if she got pregnant, or if she even got married, or gained weight, or turned 32, she was fired. So there were a lot of things. There was a lot of sexual harassment going on, and that's still happening today.
Unfortunately, yes.
That's right. So there were a lot of things. Women in some states could not serve on a jury. A married woman could not get credit in her own name. So this was an entirely different. Women couldn't go to college in some places. It was very hard for a woman. Very few women were doctors and lawyers. Women were shut out of the professions. So this was a time that women were very concerned about a lot of injustices, and they were all pulling together to try to correct those. And when Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1963, that was the relaunch of the women's movement in the 20th century. She was saying that women were at home, they were bored, they were housewives, they were educated, they wanted to get out and work in the workforce, they wanted their own lives, they also wanted to be mothers, but they wanted the whole thing. They wanted a lot more than they had. And so at that time, Betty wrote her Feminine Mystique book, and everybody went crazy. They said, yes, we agree with this. They all agreed with the women's movement. It was very unifying in those days.
And what impact did Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique have on you as a young woman in the workforce in the 60s?
Well, I think the impact that it had was I felt like I could do anything. I really, by the time, that was 63 that she wrote that book. By the time I got out of college, it was 68. And 69, I thought I could set the world on fire. And then when I found out that I was going to get fired for being pregnant, I was like, what? What? Well, this women's movement was obviously for me.
And what interested you about Cosmo? Why did you go for the job?
Well, I was glamour struck. I was a small town girl from Iowa, and I was very glamour struck. But also when I was at the University of Missouri, we had a class where we studied magazines and what were they doing in those magazines. If you were going to write for this magazine, what would you do? Magazine markets, it was called. So I chose Cosmopolitan. I was fascinated with these magazines. So then when I got to New York City, the reason I got the job at Cosmo, it was just advertised in the New York Times. I didn't know it was Cosmo. It was just a magazine that they were looking for an editorial assistant. And so I applied, it was Cosmo. And I was like, wow. And there were 18 people that applied for the job, and I got it.
Now, Helen Gurley Brown, the editor of Cosmo, you had some interesting conversations with her, and you learned some interesting things you share in your book about how Cosmo got across a certain philosophy or message to women at the time. Right. Can you share more about that?
Right. She taught that sex without the kids and hard work will set you free. That was Gurley Brown's philosophy. She was had been a copywriter in California. She was one of the biggest advertising copywriters in the country. She was very good at what she did. And then she took Cosmopolitan, which had been a homemaker's magazine, and turned it into a sex rag, basically. And it was very, very popular in those days. Cosmo was the hottest women's magazine in the nation. And that was her philosophy. Hard work and sex without the kids will set you free. She didn't have children. She was married, but she didn't have children, nor did she want them. She said children were more of a nuisance than a blessing. And you could get married, but you should have abortions, or you should use the pill. And if the pill failed, you should have an abortion.
Can you tell me more how she instructed you and other writers, to sell her particular ideology?
We made up a lot of those stories. It was just, for example, a young woman, her name is Mia, she goes to Paris, she meets a man on the Champs-Elysees. That night, they fall in love that day. They go to hotel on the left bank, and the next morning, she knows that she's in love. It's all beautiful. It was all made up. There was no Mia, there was no hotel on the left bank. It was all an illusion. And we created this fantasy world. The Cosmo girl, at least in the beginning, before a lot of women began to buy into it, the Cosmo girl was just a sexual fantasy. She was a marketer's dream, however, because she would work hard, and she was on the pill, and she would get an abortion, so they weren't going to have to fire her for being pregnant, because she was never going to get pregnant. Okay, she didn't press for working women's rights. She didn't press for family rights. She didn't press for child care. She just worked hard and for the corporation. Basically, she was a man.
So it would make sense. I mean, Helen Gurley Brown's sexual revolution. Then, what was abortion to them? How did abortion fit in with their plans?
Well, first of all, Helen Gurley Brown, I don't know if she ever had an abortion. She did not get married until she was 37. She was married for 50 years to the same man. But the reason abortion fit into her plans of the way women should get ahead was because she was selling the life that corporate America wanted women to live. So that they could have women working, but they wouldn't have to mess around with all that.
So in that way, pregnant women and moms were an inconvenience to Helen Gurley Brown, just like they were to a lot of employers.
There was a secret that nobody knew, is that mothers were not actually in the magazine. You never saw a mother in the magazine. You never saw a child in the magazine. Propaganda is half-truth, selected truth, and truth out of context. It isn't just a bunch of lies. And one thing that people don't recognize about propaganda when they look at it is look for the things that aren't there. The things that are invisible. The mother and the child was invisible in the Cosmo girl philosophy.
So Helen Gurley Brown, she has this magazine. There's no kids, there's no women, there's no pregnancy. It's about sex, it's about products, it's about this materialism.
Right.
How did that flesh with her own lifestyle? Because from all accounts, she married one guy and expected him to be faithful to her and lived her life out with him.
Right. They were married for 50 years. Remember, she didn't get married until she was 37. And Helen said that this was the way she had lived in the beginning. This is how she got so far ahead. She urged young women to sleep their way to the top. Sleep with the boss if he's a married man. And she said, it's good to sleep with a married man.
Women sleeping with her married husband. So that was more other people should live that lifestyle. Not her and her family.
Not her family, not her husband, especially not her husband.
What did Betty Friedan think of Helen Gurley Brown and Cosmo?
She thought Cosmo was quite obscene and quite horrible. Betty Friedan said that the women's movement was about a woman's personhood. And she said that Cosmo, which was turning women into a sex object, was denying women's full personhood. So just to turn woman into a sex object was not at all what she had in mind. She was fighting for equal respect and dignity in education and the workforce. So these two were two radically different movements. When I was at Cosmo sitting there, I could see that. I mean, Helen Gurley Brown would have loved to have been part of the women's movement, but Betty Friedan called the Cosmo quite obscene and quite horrible, and even at one point called for a boycott of the magazine.
Wow. Betty Friedan wrote that landmark book, Feminine Mystique, but she wasn't the first feminist. She wasn't the founder of the women's movement. Can you share more about some of the original feminists and the early feminist movement in the United States?
Well, the suffragists, they fought to give women the right to vote. And Alice Paul was a Quaker. She was widely credited with being one of the ones that got women the right to vote in the constitutional amendment. There were also Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and so these women were very pro-life, pro-family. Betty Friedan talked in her book about being very pro-family. She was saying that women needed to combine work with family. She wasn't saying, no, abandon the kids, go out and work and never come back. She was saying we needed both.
So Betty Friedan, do you see her and her feminine mystique as an extension of the earlier women's movement? Alice Paul, Susan B. Anthony?
I think she felt that she was doing that. I know when there was a meeting and the old suffragists were there, she was very, very pleased and very, very excited.
You had said that Betty Friedan called Cosmo quite obscene and quite horrible. And that's because there's a personhood element in the women's movement of Friedan, and the earlier women's movement is about women's liberation, women's full identity, instead of the Cosmopolitan's view of just their sexuality and getting ahead in a material way.
That's exactly right. There was one thing that they all had in common, though. Betty Friedan did have a very materialistic understanding. When she listened to these women at home who were having so many problems, she immediately concluded that if they just got out and got a job and made some money, they'd be happy. Well, we've seen the results of that philosophy. That hasn't actually materialized either.
But she was anti-Cosmo.
Oh
Betty
yes,
Friedan.
oh yes, because she was the whole sexual revolution and the women's movement were two radically separate movements. So when you ask, why did you write this book Subverted? Well, when I was sitting there and I saw that they were two radically separate movements, how did they ever get joined together? How did we get to the point where there's so many women today, young women especially, who think that to be liberated is go to college, get a great degree, have a fantastic career, and be as sexually free as possible? How did those two get joined together? Well, that was the question in my mind that led to writing this book.
So how do you think we should look at Betty Friedan and her feminine mystique in regard to abortion, which the early women's rights movement was opposed to?
She never mentioned abortion or contraception in her feminine mystique. She was fighting for women's freedom in academia and the public square, in the workforce. In fact, Betty Friedan had been fired herself for being pregnant in the 1940s.
So tell me how it went from Betty Friedan writing the feminine mystique, not even mentioning abortion, as you say, to being the president of the National Organization for Women and inserting abortion on demand in their Bill of Rights?
That's a good question, because what happened behind the scenes was there was a man, there were actually two men, but one man named Larry Lader, people have never even heard of him today, but he was the co-founder of NARAL, the National Abortion Rights Action League, which was originally the National Association to Repeal Abortion Laws, and is now NARAL Pro-Choice America. You see how those names shift depending on what the climate is. This is the way propaganda works. But anyways, Larry Lader co-founded NARAL with Bernard Nathanson, who was an abortionist who claimed to be responsible for 75,000 abortions before he saw a baby on a fetal monitor and realized this was a living human being, changed his mind, became very pro-life. So these two men, Larry Lader and Bernard Nathanson, had founded this organization, and Larry Lader knew Betty Friedan very well. They were magazine writers together in New York. Larry Lader had graduated from Harvard University. He was fairly independently wealthy. He had lots of time on his hands, and his greatest passion was to make abortion legal. And he worked on Betty Friedan for years to try to convince her to insert abortion into her list of demands as a woman's right. And the first thing that he did that helped convince her that abortion was a woman's right was he wrote a book. And here it was actually what I call a masterpiece of propaganda, because it's full of half-truth, selected truth, and truth out of context. Now look at the subtitle of this book, Abortion. The first authoritative and documented report on the laws and practices governing abortion in the U.S. and around the world, and how, for the sake of women everywhere, they can and must be reformed. Now that is
God's gift to women, Larry
That's
Later.
Right, that's right.
His
now,
attitude. Yeah.
For years, Larry Later tried to convince Betty Friedan that abortion, women needed abortion to be free. And Betty Friedan didn't buy it. She didn't see abortion as a woman's right. It just didn't even cross her radar.
But so that's Betty Friedan, Feminine Mystique,
right.
The founder of the 20th century women's movement,
exactly.
mid-20th century. And then you also have Larry Later. Before he wrote Abortion, he was a good friend of Margaret Sanger's,
that's
the founder
right.
of Planned Parenthood.
Founder of Planned Parenthood. In fact, he was Margaret Sanger's biographer, and he said that she was the greatest influence in his life. And so she was teaching him population control, how to control the population. And he bought into that hook, line, and sinker too. But the one thing that Margaret Sanger did not agree with him on was abortion. Larry Later, his greatest passion was to make abortion legal. And he thought that that's what we needed. First of all, what women needed to be free, but second of all, what the population controllers needed to keep the population down. If we were going to have all this sex, and the sexual revolution was running rampant, well, you're going to have to do something, he thought, to keep the population down. And abortion was his solution.
So you have Betty Friedan writing Feminine Mystique, not talking about abortion as a means to advancement for women. You have Margaret Sanger running Planned Parenthood, but not pushing for abortion at the time. Right. And then enter Larry Later in the years before the Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade. And he's this man who knows both Friedan and Sanger. Yes, and he writes this book saying, actually, ladies, abortion is the way to go. Can you share more about what you shared in your book, Subverted, about his book, Abortion?
Right, so he wrote this book on abortion, and Betty Friedan thought it was really quite a wonderful book. And so he began to convince her that this was something that women needed to be free. He had begun to convince her. And then, when she was having troubles with the National Organization for Women, she was beginning to lose control. There were a lot of young radicals coming in and screaming and yelling, and there were also, so she was having two problems on two fronts. She was losing control of the National Organization for Women, and she was also trying to get her Bill of Rights passed through to Congress. She was creating a political Bill of Rights that would guide Congress for women. That's what she was trying to do. And Larry Later convinced her that she needed abortion to get all her other rights accepted by Congress. Remember, this is a time that women are being fired for being pregnant, so they can say to the businessmen, don't worry about it, guys, she'll be on the pill, and if the pill fails, she'll have an abortion. So you're fine, you can pass all these other rights. You can give mothers the right to work and all of this, and you don't have to fire women for being pregnant, because they won't be.
So
right?
this vision that Later had, this wealthy white man had for abortion in America, he ended up succeeding, because can you share about how National Organization for Women eventually did put abortion into their platform?
Okay, Larry Later told Bernard Nathanson, who is his co-founder of NARAL, that they had to recruit the feminists, because it couldn't be just men promoting abortion. That would be too obvious. So they had to recruit the feminists, and once they convinced Betty Friedan to insert abortion into the women's movement, then after that, abortion just took off like just amazing. It soared, and then we had the Roe v. Wade. If women were demanding abortion, oh, this was something new. Men didn't realize that women wanted abortion. Oh, okay, well, I guess we'll do this then.
At one point you describe in Subverted, Larry Later is in a car with abortionist Bernard Nathanson, and they're having this fierce debate about whether or not to recruit the women's movement, the feminists, to the abortion cause.
Larry wanted to recruit the feminists. Bernard Nathanson was afraid that if they recruited the feminists, that they had all these wild-eyed women pushing for abortion, the judges and legislators, who were mostly white men, would dismiss the abortion cause. So he said that if women were defending abortion, it would actually set their cause back.
So these men are trying to scheme about how to get women to support abortion.
Right.
And they're worried about how they can control the feminists in convincing male legislators.
That's right. And if male legislators see all these wild-eyed women fighting for abortion, they thought maybe that would set their cause back, because all those legislators and judges were white men.
But it ended up working because because Justice Blackmun ends up quoting Larry later.
Right.
And they didn't even need the legislature. Right. They had the Supreme Court.
Well, you see, the thing of it was, there were so many rights in the women's movement that were legitimate justice, fighting for legitimate justice. And again, what they did was they plunked that abortion into the middle of all that, and it was hard for people to separate it out. That's one of the things that they do. They bundle things together. That's one of the propaganda tools. Bundle things together so you can't separate the good from the bad. And that's what happened in that case. And so before the National Organization for Women embraced abortion, it was only a white upper-class men's movement primarily.
And that was Bernard Nathanson, a co-founder of NARAL, upper-class white male.
Right.
Alan Guttmacher, who presided over Planned Parenthood when they actually came in support publicly of abortion.
He was a doctor.
He was a doctor after Margaret Sanger. So these three were really core to pushing abortion into the women's movement.
Yes, they were. Yes, they were. Especially, though, Bernard Nathanson and Larry Lader, who knew Betty Friedan. And so there was actually a night, and it took me a long time, a couple of years actually, to find this night. There was actually a night when abortion was inserted into the women's movement. It was on November 18th, 1967, in the Mayflower Hotel in the Chinese Room, when about 100 people, mostly women, but a few men were there, and they were going to vote on the National Organization for Women's Bill of Rights.
And this was after Larry Lader had many conversations with Betty Friedan. He had already published his book, Abortion.
Right.
And now they're getting together, and tell us what happened that night.
Okay, that night it was wild. There were 8 rights that they voted on that night, and most of them, 6 of them passed unanimously, and are rights we would all agree on. There were things: women should have equal pay for equal work, women should not be fired for being pregnant, women should have equal access to educational opportunities. These were all things that everybody agrees on today. There were only 2 rights that night that they fought over. One was the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, why did they fight over that? Well, one woman who was very articulate said, and she was a civil rights attorney, said human rights are indivisible. And if you separate women's rights out from other people's rights, you've destroyed a lot of things.
They're not indivisible.
They're not indivisible anymore. And
we all share the same rights.
She said we're all persons.
Yes, we're all
right?
persons.
And you see, but you see what Roe v. Wade did was they did separate out women's rights from men. And look at the mess it's made. But anyway, we're going to go back.
And that 7th, you said there's 7 things that were determined, and the 7th was the one that caused the most controversy that night.
The 8th.
The 8th.
It was the last right to be fought over that night, and they fought until almost midnight. That was the abortion right. It was wild. People were screaming. Now this is the founders of feminism in the 1960s. This is not a bunch of radical anti-abortionists. These are the feminists fighting over abortion. And some of the things they said in that meeting, because I got the minutes to the meeting, were things that people are seeing today. One person said, "I'm against murder."
So this is a group of mostly women, after Lader's book, before Roe v. Wade, after the book Abortion, and Betty Friedan is presiding over the National Organization for Women, and they're deciding their Bill of Rights. And you're saying the hottest debate that they had that night was over abortion.
That's right.
And there were many opposed, as there were others arguing for it.
They were fighting for it nonstop. There were a lot of people opposed. In fact, they were so opposed that at least 1/3 of those women walked out and later resigned from NOW over the abortion vote.
They completely left the organization.
They completely left the organization.
Wow.
And so what you had there that night, behind the scenes, something that's never been reported except in this book, Subverted, for the first time, is that you had pro-life feminists leaving the National Organization for Women and pro-abortion feminists staying. And then you got to the point when if any woman was for abortion or against abortion, she was kicked out of the organization.
And shortly after that night, Betty Friedan came out with a statement on behalf of NOW and saying that she was speaking on behalf of all women.
Yes, she did.
Saying that Abortion Now was the platform. Abortion on demand. Later on, it would be abortion on demand without apology. Can you break that down for us, how that decision made that night by a handful of women ended up being the statement for all women?
Well, that's what happened. She came out. Now, there were only 57 people in that room that voted for abortion that night. But Betty Friedan knew how to control the press. And she came out, that was on a Saturday night. On Monday morning, she came out with a press release that she handed out to all the newspapers that said she was speaking for millions of women around all over America, the working mothers who wanted to get back into the workforce, college women, all these working women. She claims to be speaking for every working woman in America, when in fact she was only speaking for 57 people in the Chinese room. And this was a closed-door meeting. The press didn't see it, and so they bought it. And then the next day, the Washington Post ran a headline on showing the abortion vote. They were headlining the abortion vote, and they said, "Now embraces the sexual revolution of the 20th century."
So they saw that. They
saw it. They
didn't even see abortion as much as they saw this is the sexual revolution.
That's right. They saw it as the whole package. So at that point, in the media's mind, in America's mind, the sexual revolution and the women's movement were joined together completely.
Over abortion.
Over abortion, because of abortion.
Even though Betty Friedan still saw Cosmo as quite horrible and obscene.
Yes, she was a very confused lady. She had been, but see, she was a utilitarian. She was ready to do anything to get her Bill of Rights passed. And when Larry Lader and Bernard Nathanson convinced her that she wouldn't get her other Bill of Rights passed unless she had included abortion, she said, okay, she was a utilitarian.
Would you say that abortion was the key for the sexual revolution to hijack the women's movement?
Yes, that was certainly the beginning. Then it went farther until they got into all sorts of sexual politics, but certainly abortion was the open door.
And specifically, Larry Lader influencing Betty Friedan
Correct.
And Roe v. Wade.
Correct.
Can you share more about his book, Abortion? It's out of print now. Very few people even know about this book. You said there's a lot of half-truths.
Yes,
truth out of context. Can you share more about that?
Well, for one thing, it was very, very hard to sort out all the lies that he told in that book, because again, propaganda is not just a bunch of lies, it's half-truth, selected truth, and truth out of context. But if you just look at, for example, the statistics, he said that there were 1 million to 1.5 million illegal abortions every year. Well, that was totally fabricated. But
and later on, Bernard Nathanson even said, we fabricated those numbers.
Yes, he did. They fabricated the numbers. And the same way they said that women were dying, all these women were dying of abortions. In fact, they knew that it was fewer than 300 that had died from abortions every year.
Sounds like they took a page out of the Cosmo playbook to make stuff up.
They did. They were making stuff up. Well, that's what one of the reasons I wrote this book is I had gone to a conference where Bernard Nathanson spoke, and he told us about all the lies that they had told to sell abortion to the American people. And then I had also written an article on Kinsey, Alfred Kinsey, who was considered the father of the sexual revolution, and all the lies that he had told. He made up a lot of stuff. It was very fabricated.
And very horrifically abused children during his so-called studies.
Exactly. So and I realized that if Kinsey had lied, and if the abortionists had lied, and if we at Cosmo were lying, then the whole sexual revolution was made up of whole cloth.
Wow.
It was all lies. And then we sold it to the American people through more and more lies, and through the women's movement. Movement. That's right. Through the women's movement, the sexual revolution was sold to the world, the whole world.
I found it striking reading Larry Lader's out-of-print abortion book, which I want you to share more about in a moment, was quoted multiple times by Supreme Court Justice Blackmun
Right.
in the Roe v. Wade decision.
Right.
But in the book, he didn't even talk about abortion in the sense of a child existing, maybe the child having rights, considering that the child might be a human being that's growing.
No.
There was almost fascinating, no discussion of the embryo of the fetus. It was focused instead on this so-called already established need for abortion.
That's right.
Why was he so obsessed with abortion?
Well, he said he was also obsessed with the sexual revolution. He wanted the sexual revolution to succeed, and he said to mess with abortion would turn all of sexual morality upside down.
So if
And
you
he
could
was
get
right.
if you could get legal abortion, he was
Right.
saying sexual morality goes out the door.
Right.
Was his position.
That's right. He believed that the middle class were just a bunch of hypocrites, that they were all really doing all this stuff, and he said it was time for that to stop.
And that was based on the research of Alfred Kinsey, because his research claimed that people were sexually licentious. There's a lot of licentiousness that later on people said he made up.
Right.
And now Larry Lader was saying, well, we need abortion in order to enable this.
Right, to enable the sexual revolution. He also was a population planner. He thought that we needed to eliminate poor children in other countries if we were going to have freedom in America. So he was also a population planner. He hated the Catholic Church. I don't know exactly where that came from, but he said that the Catholic Church was the greatest, I don't have the exact words here, but basically the hierarchy of the Catholic Church was the greatest evil in history. And he said, interestingly enough, that we're going to have to recruit some of the liberal Catholics to be good showpieces for us.
For the abortion movement.
For the abortion movement.
Them and the feminists.
Yes, and he succeeded.
And I found it also very telling that in his book Abortion, he talks about abortion being necessary for sexual freedom, basically.
Right.
But he doesn't once really address that maybe sexual freedom is something that can be lived out in a marriage relationship, that it can actually lead to children. That's a good thing. It seemed to be that wasn't even part of his calculation.
No, it wasn't.
There was a book that you referenced as well, Dispelling the Myths of Abortion. Can you share more about that?
Would you like
that
to see
book?
let's
see it.
See a picture of it? When people say, what kind of lies did he tell? How can you tell me all the lies that Larry told in his abortion book? This guy wrote a book showing you it. Look at this.
It looks like you've had a lot of reading with this one.
And this was Joseph Della Pena. He's a history professor from Villanova University. And he says that rather than abortion being women's secret, men seem to have been involved in the decision regarding abortion and the doing of abortions for as long as we have recorded history. And he says that accounts that seek to portray abortion as a woman's secret, which is what Larry Lader did, also neglect or deny the coercive aspects of male involvement in abortion, or that even purely female networks could be and often were coercive. So he's talking about, there was a lot of coercive, and there still is today. So Larry Lader, in his idolization, it was really a false idol.
How did Larry Lader's book Abortion influence Roe v. Wade?
It was very important as an influencer in Roe v. Wade. Larry Lader's lies that he told in his book were quoted 7 times in Roe v. Wade, and Cyril Chestnut Means, who was a NARAL attorney and was one of Larry Lader's cohorts, had written a history that is quoted 7 times in Roe v. Wade. So Roe v. Wade, but here's the interesting thing. I tried to sort that out and say, okay, let's look at all the ways Roe v. Wade was misguided by Larry Lader. And what I found out was the structure of the argument, the whole structure of the argument was based on Larry Lader's argument. And when you structure, I personally know as a writer that the structure of a book is what persuades. And after a while, once you've written a book with the structure disappears. So the structure is there in Roe v. Wade, but if you don't know where it came from, it's invisible. So that is the amazing thing. That's why we fought over Roe v. Wade for 50 years. Every legal, historical, sociological, and religious assumption in Roe v. Wade has been challenged, both by liberal and conservative lawyers, and it's because it was written based on this propaganda book. And I knew that Larry Lader's book was quoted in Roe v. Wade, but I wanted to know, how did it get in there? When did Harry Blackmun find Larry Lader's book and quote it so many times? Well, it turned out I went to the U.S. Supreme Court and to the Library of Congress and looked at the Harry Blackmun papers. And what I found out was it was not Harry Blackmun per se who found that book, but his 28-year-old law clerk who found it, while Harry was in Minnesota. And it was his 28-year-old law clerk that actually wrote that book into that opinion.
So you have this Supreme Court case that has been called since then by both the left and the right, decried, poorly written, poorly documented, poorly substantiated. And it's incredible things saying abortion is somehow a right, defining this new constitutional right. And you're saying that you believe that it was written basically after Larry Lader's abortion book, and not even written by Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun, but by a law clerk that seemed to be enamored with Larry Lader's book.
Who was certainly pro-abortion. Very liberal, a young law clerk, 28 years old, was very pro-abortion. Harry Blackmun was a good old boy from Minnesota. He was married with 3 children, and he was having a lot of struggles with that writing of that Roe v. Wade opinion. He didn't quite know what to do. Abortion was a woman's right. He never heard of such a thing. And so he was struggling with it mightily. And when he went to the Mayo Clinic that summer to try to figure out, he went to do his own research. Now, this is something I didn't know. Can a Supreme Court justice, he didn't think the arguments in Roe v. Wade were very good. So he's running off to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota to do his own research. Is that what Supreme Court justices do? They do their own research because the arguments weren't good? But at any rate, that's what happened. And while he was there at Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, his 28-year-old law clerk wrote the history of Roe v. Wade and sent it to him. And Harry says, "Thank you very much. Now I'm off the hook." I mean, he didn't say that, but that was the feeling.
And Larry Lader and his friend are quoted 14 times.
14 times.
In Roe v. Wade.
Right.
So Roe v. Wade becomes the ruling of the court in this famous 1973 ruling, and America's never been the same since. And it's something that affected you personally as well, Sue, which you share in your book. Can you share a little bit more about that experience, having your own abortion, and the effect that the Supreme Court decision and the change in law even had on your life?
Well, a year after Roe v. Wade, my husband and I got pregnant with my 3rd child, and my husband and I were financially struggling at the time. We were both working temporary jobs. Remember, now I had been fired once for being pregnant. Now the Pregnancy Discrimination Act has not been passed yet. You can still be fired for being pregnant. And so at that point, both of us panicked, and I had an abortion. I would never have had an abortion had it not been legalized by Roe v. Wade. And I have to say, I was scared. And I didn't think much about it. It was only now, looking back over this, that I realized, as the abortion debate heated up and everybody fought more and more and more over it, I realized, oh my God, I killed my own child. But I didn't put it that way then. I was just, this is a way out of a difficult situation. And I think maybe a lot of women think that. And then later, they have to suffer the consequences. And I struggled with that actually until I was 57 years old, until I came into the Catholic Church and I was healed from it through confession. And I often urge women who've gone through abortion, go to confession if you're Catholic, be forgiven, God forgives you, and you can be healed from this pain, and then you can talk about it, and you can be one of the people that fights against it.
It's beautiful.
That's right.
Can you share more about that time in your life when you were going through healing from your abortion? You said you became Catholic.
Yeah, we
Can
became
you share
Catholic
more about
first.
your conversion?
Yes, it was before I became Catholic, and then I was healed because it was during confession. My husband wanted to become a Catholic, and I think he had always been a Catholic, but he just didn't know it. And I said, I'm not going to join that patriarchal old church. I was still quite a feminist, you know, but we went and talked to a priest, and he said, read the catechism. I got that catechism, and I read it for 3 days straight. I could not put it down. This was not the old Catholic church I'd heard about. This was all about love and peace and joy and forgiveness. And it was the truth that I had been searching for my whole life. And when I found it, it just set my heart on fire. And many wonderful things have happened since then. But one of them, of course, was the healing from that abortion. And I just can't tell you how happy I am as a Catholic.
It's beautiful. And you do an incredible sharing of that story into the church for both you and your husband, your love story in your book, Subverted. It's absolutely beautiful and heart-wrenching.
Thank you.
The sexual revolution promised to make women free. Has it?
No, of course not. No, of course not. It's destroyed marriages. It's separated sex from marriage. It's separated sex from love. You know, just if it feels good, do it. It's separated men from women.
Or if you're Harvey Weinstein, if you want to do something, do it.
That's right.
Regardless of what
That's
other
right.
people want.
The sexual revolution, as Helen Gurley Brown defined it, it was included in work. Sex and work should go together. It didn't say you shouldn't sexually harass you. It said, yeah, go for it. You know, have sex with the married man. Go to the top. You know, work your way up.
So sexual harassment was a good thing if you were the one using sex in the workplace.
She would have said, you know, oh, don't be so pippy-poo about it. You know, let men do what they do. She was. Well, Helen was Helen. I won't say any more.
You mentioned, Sue, that fateful night when Betty Friedan, presiding over National Organization for Women, inserts abortion after 57 votes into the platform. And some pro-life feminists walked out.
That's right.
They left National Organization for Women. Right. What happened to those pro-life feminists?
That's an interesting question. One of them was a woman we've never heard of named Betty Boyer. She was a Cleveland attorney. She said that a human life, a baby's life, is a sacred trust. And she went back to Ohio, and she was going to give women the organization that she had promised them. And she created an organization called the Women's Equity Action League, WEAL. And nobody has ever heard of that. I spoke in Cleveland to a pro-life group, and I said, has anybody ever heard of WEAL? And they said, no, nobody had heard of it. Nobody has heard of Betty Boyer. But that organization only had 10,000 people, but it did wonderful work. They opened up academia to women. They got rid of help wanted male and help wanted female ads in newspapers. They fought for sports programs in schools. They fought against.
Amazing.
They did amazing work, and they fought for a lot of things that women wanted. They got the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978 passed, which made it illegal to fire women for being pregnant. They fought for a lot of these rights. They fought for married women to be able to get credit in their own name. They fought in the courts, and they fought behind the scenes. So what was happening now at this point, well, they were fighting these wars in the courts. Now, for a long time, didn't even have a lawyer on staff.
So now was busying themselves with the sexual politics and with abortion. These other women are fighting and making advances for women in politics and economically. Can you talk more, and you share this in your book, how the pro-abortion feminists then started taking credit for the advances of pro-life feminists?
Well, it was more a matter of the pro-life feminists not wanting the publicity, okay? Because I talked to Betty Boyer's niece, and she said they didn't want the publicity. These were women with good jobs. They didn't want their bosses to know they were out there on those lines picketing and stuff like that. So when the more, if you wanted to call it liberal women who were also pushing the sexual revolution wanted to take credit for all of these things. I'm not saying that they didn't work on them at all. Yes, they did. But they worked together some. So when they wanted to take all the journalistic credit for it, all the media credit for it, we people at Wheels said, just let them have all the credit. Now you look back on it and say, the pro-life women should have spoken up at that time, but they didn't. They worked under the scenes and now got all the media credit for it.
Betty Friedan ended up writing another book, The Second Stage, in which she expresses regrets about her role in the sexual revolution, bringing that into the women's movement. Can you share more about that?
She was defending the family. She said that we should stop overemphasizing abortion rights and get on with defending the family. She says our problem was our blind spot about the family. And even as late as the year 2000, listen to what she wrote. She said, ideologically, I was never for abortion. Motherhood is a value to me, and even today, abortion is not. I believed passionately in 1967, as I do today, that women should have the right of chosen motherhood. For me, the matter of choice has never been primarily the choice of abortion, but that you can choose to be a mother. And she says, that is as important as any right written into the Constitution.
I find that so fascinating, Sue, because Betty Friedan is identifying we should be able to know how our bodies work and know when we're having children and be able to plan for that. And Larry later, he never really talked about women understanding their bodies, fertility awareness. There was this idea that you have sex equals you're going to get pregnant equals you should have access to abortion. There was no discussion of understanding how our bodies work and how our sexuality works.
That's right. And women are now taking charge without having to pump their bodies up with chemicals, and they're taking charge of the true charge of their sexuality.
So Betty Friedan's feminine mystique never mentions abortion. Later on, she accepts abortion. And then later on, after that, she writes another book and makes statements about her regret, a regret about missing a mark. She thought she missed a certain mark. Can you share more about that?
Her blind spot, she said, was the family. She reduced women in the feminine mystique to their economic potential and their academic potential. Which was what she wanted at that time. She wanted to get back. She'd already raised her 3 kids, and she wanted to get back in the workforce, and she was having troubles finding it, getting back into it. So she reduced women. It was always a reduction. The sexual revolution reduced women to being sex objects. Betty Friedan reduced women to being economic players, I guess, the people who were going to make all the money. Political. She reduced women to their political needs and stuff like that. So you had this reduction of women. The old days was they reduced women to housewives. A woman is not to be reduced to any single role in her life. A woman is to be respected for her full personhood. And there were too many reductions of a woman's personhood. And that's what we're fighting today, is those reductions. Everybody says, I've got the answer. No, you don't. No, she's not just a sex object. And then somebody says, oh, well, she should be only a stay-at-home mom. No, that's not right either.
What's the common theme for all of these views of women?
Well, I think the common theme is that they're not treating women as persons, especially as choosing persons who can do their own thing. They're all compartmentalizing women into certain categories that you can sell products to. Betty was fighting against selling products to the housewife. Well, now we've got everybody selling products to the women who are sexually active. It's always about selling stuff to women rather than viewing women as full persons who have the right to do their own thing, to have their own decisions, their own lives, that are not, that a woman is not what she has, it's who she is. And they're all looking at women through how can we exploit this consumer. How can we exploit this consumer called a woman? No, 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 no. Stop that right now.
What do you think is the solution for today's women? We're in the aftermath of Roe v. Wade, of 60 million abortions now. We're in the aftermath of the sexual revolution, now the horrific sexual assault cases that are now, they've always been there, but now people are actually concerned, thank God. But how are we doing today, and what can we do about it as women?
I think as young women, especially, you need to realize that the pro-life movement is the true feminism of the 21st century, and you need to take charge of that. Yes, my generation did some good things. You know, we got the Pregnancy Discrimination Act passed. You're no longer fired for being pregnant. We got a lot of good things done, but we made a lot of mistakes. And the mistake we made was joining the sexual revolution to the women's movement. We need to separate those out. Women realize that woman is most free when she is connected in love with others, and stop trying to turn a woman into a sex object. Separate, if we can, separate those two out again and say women to be free need to be women who are treated with dignity and respect. And the sexual revolution does not do that.
It's beautiful, connected in love to others.
That's right, that's right.
And Betty Friedan's critique in Feminine Mystique was they're subordinate in love to others, as far as instead of connected, as in equal in dignity.
That's right.
So would you say the women's pro-life movement today is the ultimate equality movement?
I think it is. I think it is. As I say, I think the women's movement, we started out with the suffragists who were pro-life. Betty Friedan was pro-family in the beginning. Wheel was pro-life. So I think that the pro-life movement, that was the thing that I realized while I was writing this book. I thought, oh my goodness, the pro-life women's movement is the authentic women's movement of the 21st century, and it was the authentic women's movement all through the 20th too. We just didn't know it.
Beautiful.
That's something.
And how can you explain that to us? The pro-life movement is the authentic women's movement.
The pro-life movement is the authentic women's movement because it's fighting for a woman's true personhood. She doesn't have to split herself between either a homemaker or in the workforce. She can have both the work at home and the work in the workplace, and she can be supported by her husband. My husband and I worked at home together. We took equal responsibility for the children, raising the children. In fact, he wrote a book called 101 Secrets a Good Dad Knows. So yes, the pro-life women's movement is the authentic women's movement of the 21st century, and men are working with us on this, and we are going to win.
Beautiful. And the idea too that we don't need to choose between children and exploring economic opportunities or education, that we can find ways and work with society to find ways to integrate. So that's pro-family as well as being pro-woman, pro-man, pro-child.
And you look around and so many women are doing it today. They're doing it in their own way, but they're all doing it. Some women are working at home, some of them are teaching classes online. There are all sorts of ways to integrate the two. And women are smart, men are smart, and we're all working together and we're doing this thing.
And there's no one mold.
There's
no
one
one
way.
should be forced into one mold.
No.
It's each person's unique way to approach it.
That's right.
Sue, what is your advice to this generation, to millennials, to Generation Z, especially to this generation of women?
I want this generation to know that they have got the answers. Go for it. The pro-life generation is representing the women's movement of the 21st century. Go for it. Yes, in the past we had some things that we did right. We passed the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. We've fought for women. Women can now be doctors and lawyers and engineers or whatever they want. Now carry this forward. Get rid of this sexual revolution that has been inserted falsely into the women's movement, and fight for your true dignity and respect in all aspects of your life.
Thank you so much again, Sue Ellen, for joining us. I'm so excited for your message to reach the Live Action followers online and beyond. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here.
And everybody be sure, again, to get your copy of Subverted, How I Helped the Sexual Revolution Hijack the Women's Movement, and hear the rest of Sue Ellen's amazing story.